Is my colleague, Andy Lamy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Lamy, and I'm a member of the faculty here in the philosophy department at UCSD. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, as well as her commentator. Our main speaker in this session is Professor Carolina Sartorio. She's in the philosophy department at the University of Arizona, and she's published a number of papers in distinguished fora on topics of direct relevance to our conference today, including moral luck, moral responsibility in relation to determinism, as well as omissions and causation. Her paper will be followed by a comment from Professor Dirk Pierboom, who's no stranger to our department, who we had the pleasure of hearing a paper of his last month in our moral and political philosophy seminar. And he's written a number of books in the area of the free will determinism debate, including most recently, Free Will, Agency, and Meaning in Life. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor, Professor Sartorio.
Or Professor 4. That's what I'm not. I think I'm going to use this, if that's okay.
Sure, just make sure
that this is what I use when I teach my classes, so it should be okay. Because I like to walk around a lot, so. Is that working? Okay, so thank you, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for this wonderful conference. I promise that I won't be speaking about unwitting omissions. I think we've had enough of that for one day. So I'm going to talk about a different puzzle involving omissions. Omissions are interesting and puzzling in many different ways. I myself come from the metaphysics side of things too, so I'm interested in some puzzles involving the metaphysics of omissions, and some of them will appear here today in this talk. This particular puzzle that I'm interested in concerns moral responsibility primarily, and it has to do with Frankfurt-Style cases, and I'll tell you what those are in a second if you don't know what they are. The main thing that I'll argue is that trying to solve these puzzles is like opening a can of worms, in that when you think you get the right answer to one of the puzzles, there's other puzzles that arise. And at least for me, I found that those other puzzles are even more puzzling and more interesting than the original ones. So there's a bit of autobiography, because I have this paper from 2005, I think, where I gave my solution to what I thought was the puzzle about Frankfurt-Style omission cases. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. But I didn't realize at the time that there were all these other puzzles arising once one gives that kind of answer to the original puzzle. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And I'll also try to provide some solutions to those new puzzles. But I suspect many of you are going to think that they're crazy. They definitely sound crazy at first. And the main thing that I'm really interested in discussing today is how the new puzzles arise and why they're puzzling. But I am going to have some tentative proposals to make. Okay, so here's the old puzzle, the original puzzle about Frankfurt-Style cases. So the background is there was the traditional model of responsibility that said responsibility requires having the ability to do otherwise, or the existence of alternative possibilities. And Frankfurt came along and wrote this crucial paper in 1969, where he provided counterexamples to that idea. He argued that moral responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities or having the ability to do otherwise. And those examples, since then, have been called Frankfurt-Style examples. The original examples involved actions. So here you have one example of that kind that I'm going to call active Frank, active for action, right? And this is an original Frankfurt-Style action case. It involves a child swimming in a pond, which is not in Frankfurt's original examples, but it doesn't matter how we do it. So there's a child swimming in a pond, and then an agent that we're going to call Frank in honor of Frankfurt, who's very mean and decides he wants for the child to die, so jumps in the water and pushes the child's head underwater until the child dies. Now, unbeknownst to Frank, as it turns out, there was this neuroscientist in the background. The neuroscientist has access to the relevant brain states and has been monitoring the agent's thoughts up to that point. And also, he has the capacity to intervene and produce certain changes in the brain, manipulate the agent's brain in different ways. So the neuroscientist is also very evil. So had Frank hesitated, the neuroscientist is determined. He wants to see the child die, so the neuroscientist would have forced him to make the same choice in that case. It's just that, as it turns out, in the actual scenario, he didn't have to do that because Frank did it completely on his own, again, while being unaware of the existence of the neuroscientist in the background. So Frankfurt argued, Frank, the agent, seems clearly responsible for many things in this case. Those things include the choice to kill the child, the act of killing the child that results from that choice, and also the death of the child. This is so even if, given the presence of the neuroscientist, he couldn't have done otherwise. As it turns out, he couldn't have made any different choice. If he had tried to make a different choice, the neuroscientist wouldn't have allowed it. But Frankfurt appealed to our intuition that the agent is responsible despite that fact. And moreover, that suggests that moral responsibility is just a function of the actual sequence of events, as people want to call it these days. So these examples motivate an actual sequence type view of moral responsibility, according to which all that really matters to an agent's responsibility is the series of events that actually explained the behavior by the agent. The neuroscientist is not part of that sequence, never intervened, so he's not relevant to the agent's responsibility. Okay, so that's the background. Now, as several people pointed out, omissions seem to behave differently, at least on the face of it, in the sense that whereas actions, as shown by Frankfurt-Style action cases, actions don't require the ability to do otherwise. Responsibility for actions doesn't require the ability to do otherwise. Responsibility for omissions apparently does. And they gave examples of different kinds. Here's a famous example by Fisher called sharks. So this time you have to imagine that the child starts to drown completely on his own. And there's an agent, again, a very evil agent who wants for the child to die. In honor of Fisher, we're going to call the agent John. So John thinks that he can save the child in this case, but again, he's evil, so he wants the child to die, decides not to attempt the rescue. Now, unbeknownst to John, there were some sharks in the water, very hungry sharks, very aggressive sharks, and if he had jumped into the water, the sharks would have instantly killed him, so he couldn't have saved the child despite what he thought. So several people pointed out that whereas there are some things that the agent seems to be responsible for in these types of cases, like for example, not trying to save the child or actually making the choice not to save the child, this seems to be there seem to be some important differences between this case and the previous case in that there are other things that the agent is not responsible, in particular, the relevant omission, his failure to save the child. So John doesn't save the child in this case, but in this case, given the presence of the sharks that would have prevented him from saving the child, he doesn't seem responsible for failing to save him, or of course for the death that results from that, the death of the child. So note that an important assumption already here is that agents can be, in principle, responsible for things other than choices. So the asymmetry, at least concerning these two cases, concerns things other than choices. The agent is responsible for the choice not to save the child, or for the choice to stay on the shore, the choice not to jump into the water. But what's interesting is that assuming agents can, in principle, be responsible for omissions, like failing to save the child, in this case, he is not. So there seems to be, at least on the face of it, an asymmetry that basically goes, whereas responsibility for actions doesn't require the ability to do otherwise, responsibility for omissions does. Now, again, there are other people who have come along and said, although there seems to be such an asymmetry, there isn't any such asymmetry, and all you have to do to realize that there is no such asymmetry is to come up with a Frankfurt-Style omission case. So an example that is just like the examples, or the types of examples that Frankfurt discussed, but one that involves omissions as opposed to actions. So this is omissive Frank on the handout. It's a Frankfurt-Style omission case. Here, what you have to imagine is, again, the agent that we're going to call Frank, or omissive Frank, again, is evil, and the child starts to drown on his own, just like in the shark's case. And there's a neuroscientist, right, who would have made him decide not to jump in, but as a matter of fact, he doesn't have to intervene because he makes that decision completely on his own. Again, unaware of the existence of the neuroscientist in the background. So some people have suggested John is responsible, well, of course he's responsible for the choice not to save the child, but he's also responsible for the omission that apparently results from that choice, the failure to save the child and the child's death. So remember that there are no sharks in the water in this case, right? So he makes the choice not to save the child, and apparently as a result of that, doesn't save the child. Now, I say, this is really odd to suggest that whereas John, the agent in sharks, is not responsible for the child's death or his failure to save the child, omissive Frank is. It's really odd because consider a variant of the shark's case where instead of the sharks just being there, it was the neuroscientists who put the sharks in the water in the first place, right? In fact, the way it goes is something like, well, the neuroscientist is considering ways of making sure that the child dies, and in particular that Frank doesn't rescue the child. And one of them is to monitor the agent's thoughts, right, very carefully, and then decide to intervene if he sees any reason to believe that things are going to go the way he doesn't want for things to go. And the other way is just to put the sharks in the water and then walk away, right? So he decides to put the sharks in the water and walks away. So now it seems like if you say that in omissive Frank, the agent is responsible, you have to say that depending on what the neuroscientist decides to do, the agent comes out responsible or not responsible for the child's death and his failure to save the child. So this particular decision as to what kind of method to use would make a difference to the agent's moral responsibility. And that seems extremely odd. Now, there are some people, Randy in particular, who have suggested ways of trying to explain this difference and try to make it sound not so puzzling and crazy, but I don't think, they haven't convinced me, at least. So I do think this is really puzzling, and we should try to avoid this if we can. So my solution to this puzzle in the 2005 paper was to suggest that omissive Frank is not responsible for the omission. He's not responsible, just like in the shark's case. What the neuroscientist decides to do, what kind of method to use, that doesn't make a difference to the agent's responsibility. So why isn't he responsible if apparently, given that he's responsible for his choice and then the choice results in his not saving the child, right? and thus in the child's death, why doesn't the responsibility carry over to his omission and to the child's death? So what I suggested back then, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, sorry, but I don't have a lot of time, is to suggest that the omission doesn't really result from the choice not to save the child, the decision not to save the child. In this diagram here, what I suggested was basically, by analogy with a Frankfurt-Style action case, we can say for sure that the agent is responsible for his choice, although he couldn't have made a different choice. So that is clear. But the omission, the failure to save the child, doesn't result from the decision not to save the child. It actually results from something subtly different from that, which is the absence of a decision, the failure to decide to save the child. The idea being sometimes we fail to make decisions without making any decisions at all. For example, there's different decisions we could make. Instead of making that decision, say the decision to save the child, we could make the decision to eat an ice cream on the shore or to do nothing at all. So the positive decisions should be distinguished from the mere absence of a decision to jump in. So now, once we draw the distinction, there's a question about where the failure to save the child comes from. What kind of event or state does it result from? And back in that paper, I suggested it results not from the decision not to save the child, but from the failure to decide to save the child. After all, if he had made the decision to save the child, then he would have saved the child. So there's what philosophers call counterfactual dependence between these two events in a way that we don't find with a decision and the failure to save the child. Or at least that's how we can imagine the case. In all of this, by the way, I'll be assuming that there's absence causation, that absence causation is possible. I don't think you really need that for any of this, for the puzzles to arise or for the solutions to work. If you don't believe absence causation is possible, then there's always other ways of dealing with these kinds of cases involving omissions. For example, a philosopher called Phil Dow argued that there is no absence causation, but there is what he called Quasi causation, which is basically counterfactual or possible causation, right? So, so there's nearby possible worlds where there are certain causal relations obtaining. That's basically what you're saying when you say that an absence causes another absence, say. So the failure to decide to save the child would cause the failure to save the child would mean something like in a nearby possible world where I make a decision that causes my saving the child. And that seems completely uncontroversial. Okay, so then my solution is he's not responsible. He perhaps appears to be responsible because we've been confusing the decision with the absence to decide. Once we draw that distinction, we see that the failure results from the absence to or the failure to decide. Now, it's not clear that the agent is responsible for the failure to decide. It is clear, perhaps, Frankfurt is right, that he is responsible for the actual decision, the positive decision. But for the failure to decide, it's not clear in particular because notice again that given that the neuroscientist is there, he couldn't have made the decision to save the child, right? He couldn't have made the decision to save the child, and this is an omission, it's an absence. So people who are not already convinced that agents can be responsible for omissions that they couldn't have prevented are not going to buy this, are not going to agree that the agent is actually responsible for that. At least that's what I think. In any case, if you don't buy this particular solution and way of explaining why omissive Frank is not responsible, it's not the end of the world. You can still think that the parallel with sharks is so obvious, and the fact that all these weird puzzling consequences result from denying the asymmetry that you might still believe with me that omissive Frank is not responsible. If he's not in sharks, then he's not in this case either. Okay, so that's all I really need for this to work, but I wanted to explain why I think he is not responsible, or how you can argue for that. Okay, so finally we can talk about the new puzzle. So I am opening the can of worms now. And the can of worms is open because if your solution to the old puzzle is to say that omissive Frank is not responsible, in the particular case of omissive Frank, the question arises, then who is responsible? Notice that in the shark's case, it seems completely fine to say no one is responsible for the death of the child. After all, there were sharks in the water. That's a natural phenomenon, unfortunate for the child, but things like that happen. So no one could have saved the child. His death is just an accident, right? An unfortunate accident. But in omissive Frank, it seems like we cannot say that, right? In omissive Frank, remember, there's the agent, Frank, and then there's a neuroscientist, right? So Frank does his own thing. He makes the decision not to help on his own. And then the neuroscientist does his own thing of making sure that the agent cannot make any other decision. And both of those things are wrong, right? So, and the child dies as a result, in a sense, of what these two people do. Because if the neuroscientist hadn't been monitoring his thoughts and hadn't put this chip in the brain or whatever, and then if omissive Frank had made the decision to jump into the water, then the child wouldn't have died because there were no sharks in the water. So then it seems that the child's death and also the omission by Frank are in some sense the result of wrongful behavior by two agents in a way that that's not the case in sharks. So then it seems that, again, there are some people in this room, Michael, who have suggested that, in fact, in cases of this kind, no one is responsible. But again, that seems really puzzling because the result really is the outcome of wrongful behavior by two agents. So I want to avoid that, again, as much as possible. So someone must be responsible. If Frank is not, then who? Well, obviously, if Frank is not, then it's got to be the neuroscientist, right? However, how can the neuroscientist be responsible, right? If in the omissive Frank case, he never intervened. Right? He was monitoring his thoughts, Frank's thoughts, but never felt a need to intervene. He never did anything. How can he be responsible then? Or in the planted sharks case, which recall was the variant of shark where the neuroscientist is the one who planted the sharks in the water in the first place, right? In that kind of case, it's a similar thing. If he hadn't done that, and then if Frank or John or whatever had jumped in the water to save the child, then the child wouldn't have died. But the sharks never attacked John or whoever the agent was, right? Because the agent never jumped in. So how can he be responsible if all he did was put the sharks in the water and then the sharks didn't do anything? So that's the new puzzle that arises. An interesting upshot of all this is that, if anything, there seems to be some new asymmetry here arising from consideration of these cases. The old asymmetry concerned the agent's own responsibility, the agent who decides not to save the child, for example, right? Whereas in action cases, he seemed responsible. In omission cases, he didn't seem responsible. Now we see that, at least if you buy what I said, and the agent is not responsible, and the neuroscientist is, then there's an asymmetry in the responsibility of the neuroscientist, right? The backup person. In the action case, Frankfurt suggested active Frank, I think I called him, is clearly responsible for the child's death. The neuroscientist is not responsible for the child's death because he never intervened, right? But here, now I'm suggesting the agent is not responsible, so the neuroscientist must be. So the neuroscientist is responsible in the omission case when he isn't in the action case. So there's this interesting asymmetry concerning not the agent's responsibility, or not only the agent's responsibility, but the neuroscientist's responsibility too. And this asymmetry concerning the neuroscientist's responsibility is interesting also because it suggests that responsibility might not always be a function of, as I said before, the actual sequence of events, as Frankfurt put it, or at least that's what seems to be the case at first sight, because the neuroscientist never intervened and somehow he manages to be responsible. The sharks never intervened, and that's what the only contribution by the neuroscientist. Somehow he manages to be responsible. So if that's true, it seems that responsibility is not, after all, just a matter of the actual sequence. I actually deny that, so we'll come back to that. I'll suggest that it still is a function of the actual sequence. But that's what appears to be the case, at least at this point. Okay, so those are the new puzzles. Now, how do we solve them? I think the key to solving these puzzles is to realize that there's really nothing special about Frankfurt-style omission cases. They instantiate a more general pattern. They're actually a specific case, specific instance of a much more general pattern, one that has come up in the philosophical literature in the past, mainly as a puzzle about causation. If that's the case, then it seems that the solution to these puzzles would have to be the same solution as the solution to those other puzzles. Okay. So what are those other puzzles? First, from the literature on causation itself, there are these cases that have been called Pre-Emptive Prevention. And here's a famous one, the catcher in the wall. Imagine that you throw a baseball at me and I catch it with my mitt. Now, behind me, there was a solid brick wall, right? And then behind the wall, a glass window, right? And the ball was more or less heading in the direction of the window after the wall. The window, of course, remains intact throughout this time, right? The puzzle is what caused the window to remain intact. If it remained intact, then it must have a cause. In some sense, it's natural to say between the wall and the catcher, right, they made it happen. If the catcher hadn't caught it and if the wall hadn't been there, then the window would not have remained intact. It would have broken. However, the puzzle is that it seems that it can't be either one. It can't be the catcher that causes the window to remain intact because the wall was there, so the window was not in any sense threatened at any time by the ball. Right? The wall would have easily stopped that ball. So that's the reason for why it seems that we can't say the catcher is the cause, but also it seems that we can't say the wall is the cause. The wall never touched the ball at all. It never did anything. That's the puzzle. On the other hand, we do want to say that between the two, somehow, they stopped it. Right? Then you're probably more familiar with the other case that I'm going to talk about, the thirsty traveler case from the causation in the law literature. There's this man who's about to take a trip into the desert, carrying his water canteen. Now, this man has two enemies who don't know anything about each other, right? X and Y. So each one of them comes up with a plan to kill the man. So at T1, the first enemy, X, drains the water out of the canteen without the man noticing, perhaps replaces the water with sand so that he can't tell, a difference in weight, something like that. Then not knowing what the first enemy did, Y, the second enemy, steals the canteen altogether. And then at T3, a later time, when the man goes into the desert, finds he doesn't have a water canteen, dies of thirst as a result. Puzzle, who caused the man's death? It seems that, again, between the two of them, right, they made it happen. If they hadn't done what they did, if the first man hadn't drained the water out, and if the second man hadn't stolen the canteen, then the traveler wouldn't have died, right? On the other hand, it seems that we can't say that X is a cause because Y stole the canteen minutes before the man decided he needed to take a sip from the canteen. So the canteen wasn't going to be there. Even if he had water, it was going to be miles away from the man when the man needed it. On the other hand, when the man stole the canteen, when Y stole the canteen didn't have any water in it. So how can that be causally efficacious to dying of thirst? So that's the puzzle. There's a common structure here. Hopefully you can start to see what the structure is. Something like this. There's a fact C, that depends on two other facts together in some sense. So fact C wouldn't have obtained had it not been for two other facts, A and B, in the sense that if A hadn't happened and if B hadn't happened, then C wouldn't have happened. So they collectively somehow managed to make this difference to C. On the other hand, the reason the puzzle arises is that given that A is present, it seems that we cannot say that B is causally efficacious. And given that B is present, it seems that we cannot say that A is causally efficacious. So they cancel each other out in some important sense. So hopefully you can see that that's the structure of the catcher on the wall and the thirsty traveler, right? So X and Y, the contribution by X and Y would be A and B, facts A and B, and then C would be the man's death. And then for the catcher on the wall, there would be the catching of the ball by the first agent, and then just the wall being there, and then C would be the window remaining intact. So what I want to argue is that Frankfurt-Style omission cases have that structure. So first, we look again at the planted sharks case. So the planted sharks case was that variant on the original sharks case where the neuroscientist is the one who planted the sharks. So the resulting fact C would be the death of the child or the agent John's failure to save the child. And then what would A and B be? A would be the contribution by the neuroscientist at T1, remember that earlier time when he planted the sharks. And then B would be the later decision by the agent John not to jump into the water. So C occurs as a result of these two facts together in the same sense. If the neuroscientist hadn't planted the sharks and if John had decided to jump in, then the child wouldn't have died, right? Because he could have rescued him. At the same time, A and B seem to render each other causally relevant in the same sense. They seem to cancel each other out because the neuroscientist planted the sharks. Now it seems that John's contribution, the decision, is not causally relevant. Because John was going to decide that later, the contribution by the neuroscientist becomes irrelevant. Okay, so that's planted sharks. Omissive Frank, I think, is similar to that. It's just a little bit harder to see because it all happens like, in the agent's brain, right? It's internal to the mind. So C would be, again, the child's death, or Frank, the agent's failure to save the child. And then what would A and B be? So A would be the contribution by the neuroscientist, so something like he's having formed the intention to intervene if needed at T1 at an earlier time before Frank comes along, and that's B, decides not to be moved by the reasons to save the child at T2. So the child dies because of A and B together. Again, if the neuroscientist hadn't formed that intention, if he hadn't set up things in that way, and then if Frank had been moved by the reasons to save the child, then the child would have been saved. However, again, given that B is present, A doesn't seem to be causally relevant, right? Given that Frank was not going to be moved by the reasons to save the child, the neuroscientist's intention doesn't seem causally relevant. Given that the neuroscientist formed that intention, Frank's not being moved by the reasons doesn't seem causally relevant. So all these cases have a similar structure. So the way I'm going to go about trying to solve these puzzles is by first explaining my solution to the thirsty traveler puzzle, what I think is the, I told you it was all going to be controversial, right? So first I'm going to tell you what the solution to the thirsty traveler puzzle is, and then we're just going to apply it to Frankfurt-Style omission cases. So my solution to the thirsty traveler puzzle is to say that indeed there is no individual causation by the agent. So X doesn't cause the traveler's death, and Y doesn't cause the traveler's death, because indeed the presence of the other agent undermines the causal efficacy, the individual contribution. However, we can still say that there's collective causation, and one that doesn't distribute among the agents. So we can say there's non-distributive collective causation. X and Y collectively caused the man's death, but neither did so individually. So here's a cause of the man's death, if you believe in absence causes. Again, you have to believe in absence causes. The man died because his water-filled canteen was not available to him at the relevant time, right? So here's an absence of an available water-filled canteen. And that absence caused the man's death. Why? Well, because if he had had available to him a water-filled canteen, then he wouldn't have died. So this, I claim, is a disjunctive fact. So it keeps getting more and more controversial as we go along. It's a fact that obtains whenever either the canteen was not available to him, or the canteen wasn't filled with water, or both, as in the actual case, where the canteen was both not filled with water at the relevant time and also unavailable to the man. But it's a disjunctive fact in the sense that it would have been true if just one of them had been true. Okay? It would have been true that his water-filled canteen was not available to him at the relevant time, for example, if the canteen had not been available to him at the relevant time, even if it contained water. So this is how I'm looking at things. Here you have another little diagram, and the double arrows are not causal arrows. They're more like truth-making or implication arrows, and a different kind of, tighter kind of non-causal relation. So when X drains the water out at T1, that guarantees that that disjunctive fact obtains, because all it takes is one disjunct. And when Y steals the canteen at T2, that guarantees that the disjunctive fact obtains, because again, all it takes is one disjunct. So both of them guarantee the obtaining of the disjunctive fact. And then the disjunctive fact, as I said before, is a cause of the man's death at T3. So we have the contributions guaranteeing something that in fact is a cause of the man's death. But they themselves don't cause the man's death, because that double arrow, remember, is not a causal connection. Again, you're probably wondering about disjunctive causation and all that. It keeps getting weirder and weirder. I guess I can say more at the Q&A, but one thing I want to say is disjunctive causation is not really that much weirder than absence causation. That's one thing. Doesn't help me much, does it? But the other thing I wanted to say is, again, you don't have to believe in absence causation in order for the puzzle to arise or in order to provide these kinds of solutions to the puzzles. If you don't believe in absence causation, perhaps you believe in something like quasi-causation, what I mentioned before, the proposal by Dow, where absence causation is roughly something like possible causation. And it's interesting because here you have a disjunctive fact that would then be quasi-causing an outcome. And what that amounts to in a quasi-causal proposal is something like this. Go to a possible world where both of these things obtain. So the canteen is filled with water, right? And the canteen is available. So here we have simply a combination of two facts, positive facts. What happens in that world? Well, the man doesn't die, right? The man survives, and there's a causal relation between them. And that seems right, right? In that possible world where he drinks from that canteen that is available to him and is filled with water, he survives as a result. So that's really all you need in order for this to work. It sounds very strange because disjunctive causation sounds strange, but you don't have to believe in any actual disjunctive causation. Perhaps all you need is disjunctive quasi-causation, and that seems a lot less controversial. So then, if that's the causal story, who is responsible for the man's death in the thirsty traveler case? Well, then it seems that if the death is caused or quasi-caused by a disjunctive fact, and each of the agent's contributions guarantees that disjunctive fact, then the right answer would be whoever is, in fact, responsible for the disjunctive fact is then responsible for the man's death, because that is the cause. So if you're responsible for the cause, right, and that foreseeably results in the outcome, you're responsible for the outcome. So the first part of the answer is to say whoever happens to be responsible for the disjunctive fact. Now, there's a tricky question here. Who is responsible for the disjunctive fact? And here you can go, again, different ways. What I'm leaning towards, at least at the time, is that given that this is basically truth-making, and we're dealing with a disjunctive fact, and each one of them provides a truth maker for that fact, but one of them acts before the other, it's got to be the first one, because the first one already made it happen in this truth-making sense, provided a truth maker for it when the second one came along. So it was kind of too late for the second one to make a difference in this sense. If that's the case, then that means that X is responsible and Y isn't. Although there's no causal difference. The difference has to do with truth-making and responsibility. In general, whoever acts or forms the relevant intention first, that's the responsible agent in these kinds of cases. So, conclusions, what you have to do is apply this kind of solution schema to our cases. In the planted sharks case, the neuroscientist would then be the responsible agent because he acts first, right? He put the sharks in the water at a time that was, in fact, much earlier than the time at which the agent decided not to jump in. And in the omissive Frank case, which was our original Frankfurt-Style omission case, something similar happens. The neuroscientist set things, put things in place or formed the relevant intentions and so on at an earlier time before Frank had to make a decision or be moved or not be moved by certain reasons to save the child. Okay, so that's my solution to the new puzzle. Indeed, we should say that the agent is not responsible and the neuroscientist is in these omission cases. Frankfurt-Style omission cases, which is exactly the opposite as from what we should say about action cases. In action cases, we should say the neuroscientist is not responsible and the agent is. It's all very strange, but I think that's the right answer. Now, I said at the beginning something about actual sequence views and how one of the puzzles had to do with Frankfurt's ideas about how these cases motivate actual sequence views. So there's an also very interesting, broader question about how this bears on theories of moral responsibility. Right? So does this really mean that actual sequence views of responsibility are false? Right? Because the neuroscientist ends up being responsible for something that he didn't cause, and by basically contributing something that didn't enter in the causal chain in the expected way. So I want to suggest very briefly that it doesn't. I'm a fan of actual sequence views. So I'm interested in trying to reconcile actual sequence views with what we should say about omission cases. So we can still say that responsibility is a function of the actual sequence. It's just that the actual sequence would be something quite different in an action case and in an omission case. In an omission case, at least of this weird kind, overdetermination type cases, the actual sequence involves disjunctive facts, and in action cases it doesn't, right? But it's still a function of that. And also, I think it would be crazy to hold agents responsible in the relevant sense for outcomes that they're completely disconnected from. So if you can't trace any kind of connection between an agent and an outcome, then we shouldn't hold the agent responsible. But we can still do that in this case because there is collective causation. So it's not like the agent, the neuroscientist in our case, is completely disconnected from what happened. So I think it does make sense to hold him responsible in these cases.